Rural China is paying the cost of the country's rapid economic gains. Separation of families, disappearing villages, and left behind children and seniors. Will families ever return to their home soil? Can a village look after its elderly residents? How can our country protect its children from abuse and neglect? Several girls have fallen victims of rape. From north to south, join Feng Xin in search of rural recovery on CCTV News.
And in the first episode of our Rural Recovery series, we start with children's education. Nearly 70% of the elementary schools in the countryside in China have disappeared since the turn of the century. The rapid decline is partly a result of massive rural-urban migration. The rural schools still open continue to face tough challenges, such as a lack of teachers and a difficulty to retain pupils there. But some areas have taken it upon themselves to improve the situation. In the Guangyuan prefecture of Sichuan province, 20 small rural schools have come together to make sure no student is left behind. Feng Xin reports.
"54. That's all the students Fanjia Elementary School has to teach. The children all come from nearby villages. They're the sole ones remaining in the area because their families can't afford to migrate to cities. The school had a hard time retaining students several years ago. That's because few teachers wanted to work in a rural school, and even fewer parents had any faith in rural education.
When I visited the homes of some families, I found that many students, whose families are not affluent at all, transferred. They left for cities not because their parents have the ability and skills to settle in cities, but because the parents wanted a better education for their children.
Most primary schools in the Lizhou district are nestled in remote mountain areas. Nearly half of them, that's 16 schools, have fewer than 150 students. Almost every teacher has to cover several subjects, but few are trained to do so. That problem is even more prominent at Jingtian Elementary School, where the average age of the teachers is over 50.
Every school official and teacher bears a big workload. Although the number of students is quite small, we still have to offer a full curriculum.
Many rural schools in Lizhou district are quite advanced because they were rebuilt after China's 2008 massive earthquake. But a lot of the principals I've met say it's teachers, not classrooms or computers, that they need desperately now. Zhang Pingyuan reached out to several of his fellow principals who were in similar straits. 16 of them formed the Rural School Alliance in December 2014 to help each other and share resources. That was when the internet came into great use for the educators. Wen Junying is the only trained music teacher in all of Lizhou's rural schools. With the help of a web camera and online class software, Wen is now able to teach and interact with all of the 3,000 students in the area at the same time.
The whole point of live classes is interaction. I can see my teaching outcomes and what I should improve. I think it greatly benefits schools that don't have music teachers.
The same method works for art classes, as only 2 trained teachers cover the entire alliance. To make sure that the students who watch the live video feeds are involved, each class also has an on-site teacher who acts as an assistant. But forming an alliance means much more than offering online classes. Establishing bonds between previously isolated schools helps motivate students and create learning communities. Teachers from different schools now host weekly discussion sessions in turn, sharing their teaching material, experiences, and problems. The exchange of information helps these rural schools gain more help and support from each other and stay stronger.
The disappearance of rural schools will lead to massive migration of the residents. The disappearance of villages will mean that of land and therefore our foundation. A school should be the most important cultural place in a village. It should be the civil high ground of a village.
It's the end of the day. Students at Fanjia School are getting ready for some bedtime stories. And there will be more tomorrow and the day after. That's because for many children in rural China, school is where they will turn the pages on the first chapter of life. Feng Xin, CCTV in Guangyuan, Sichuan province.
And for more on rural education, let's bring in my colleague Feng Xin, who has been reporting on this. Good evening, Feng Xin. And you mentioned in your story the number of Chinese rural schools has reduced dramatically beginning in the early years of this century. Because of the urbanization, many schools were moved into urban areas. But how profound is this kind of change?
Well, Zhou Yue, I would say the change is almost irreversible. Let me pull out some numbers here. In the year of 2000, China had about 440,000 rural schools, but by the end of 2014, that number had shrunk to fewer than 130,000, marking a 70% decline. Well, some argue that by moving village students to county or township schools enables better allocation of educational resources, such as teachers and facilities, the policy actually brought little benefit. For example, many of these village children have to travel dozens of miles to schools every day. To save on this, some are forced to enroll in boarding schools and live away from their families at a very young age. Nutrition, safety, their psychological development, and the quality of teaching have all become issues, which have ultimately led to a higher dropout rate. The government recognized the problem and suspended the policy in 2012. However, since then, only a small number of the rural schools have been able to reopen. Most haven't been able to recover sufficiently. Now, if you travel to rural China, you can see many abandoned school sites. That's what I mean when I say the effect may be irreversible, Zhou Yue.
And of course, the rural schools are up against it for many reasons. One of them is probably the lack of teachers and students as well. But what do you think can be done to address this problem?
Well, first of all, this has a lot to do with the hiring system of China's public schools. And most of the country's rural schools are completely funded by the government. Local education departments demand that the number of teachers per school is based on the number of students. In large urban schools, it's quite normal for one educator, for example, to teach 16 students on one particular subject. But in rural schools, there might only be 16 students in the whole school, and it would be extremely difficult for just one or two teachers to cover all of the students who are at different academic development, and not to mention on different subjects. And since these schools are public funded, they really don't have the budget to hire more teachers by themselves. And the second problem is that rural school teachers are significantly underpaid. This is a vicious circle. The smaller a school gets, the fewer teachers are hired, and the greater the workload the remaining teachers have to bear. But their income stays the same. This makes rural schools an unattractive prospect. The Chinese government issued a 5-year plan to support rural teachers last year. For example, teacher quotas in rural schools should be based on the number of classes rather than the number of students. The central government should increase the number of rural teachers being paid by the national revenue to relieve the local education budget. Rural teachers' salaries and benefits should be increased, and retired urban school teachers are encouraged to work in rural schools. If these measures can be adopted, China's rural schools might face a much brighter future. Now you can find interactive maps and virtual reality photos of these rural schools that I visited by scanning the code at the bottom of your screen with your smartphone. You can also find more of my reporting for this Rural Recovery series from this multimedia collection. That's for me. Back to you, Zhou Yue.
Thank you so much, Feng Ying, for your excellent reporting. Thank you.